some of the questions. Now you have a holistic perspective, which is if I can say this also Hamdi Saab's perspective, I believe, if I'm
Absolutely.
correct in that. I don't
Mhm.
want to misattribute something to him.
Basically, he's my supervisor and teacher, especially. So, I can say that my work. In fact, if I go a little more broad, I would say my work is actually an explanation of Hamiduddin Farahi's thesis on the collection of the Quran and, of course, the transmission, which he put forth about 100 years ago. And Ghamidi Saab is a student of one of his students, of Farahi's
Students,
students.
yeah.
So it's like uh, presenting the works of Farahi, Islahi, and Ghamidi, and then elaborating some more details and incorporating some more contemporary details in the works of these three scholars.
That's amazingly put. So there is this legacy
Right.
of coming right down from Allama Farahi Saab right down through Islahi Saab and then Ghamidi Saab right now. In a paragraph before we begin expanding, what is the view that you espouse about the Quran? So, as opposed to the objections and the counter theories, just your theory or Ghamdi Saab's theory. What is this? When you say the Quran is preserved, how would you put yours, just to be clear on it, and then we'll expand on the other problems and objections that people may have.
So the Quran was primarily preserved verbatim through the oral lore, I would say, and orally through memorization. The Quran was committed to memory, and thousands of the Sahaba they committed it to memory. The Suhuf were secondary because you see, in those times, the diacritical marks and the vowel marks, although they were present, but they were sparingly used, and everything that was written followed that oral recitation. So the primary mode of recitation, if we talk about it in very secular terms, is that a very large number of people memorized various parts of the Quran, some of them whole parts, some of them partially, and then they transmitted that oral recitation to the next generation. So it was like a generation to generation transfer. It was not like a few people transmitting to a few people, and precisely this is what we call tawatur in our I would say religious terms. Although the term tawatur is not just religious, it's historical, which means that such a vast number of people transmit something that their collusion on falsehood is virtually rendered illogical and impossible. So it was like saying that thousands of Sahaba committed the Quran to memory and passed it on to the next generation and to the next generation. And this is like a pyramid, which is continuously coming down and expanding its base. And the topmost pyramid, or the topmost section of the pyramid itself, consisted of such a large number of people as you can say that it was safely and securely transmitted to the next generation. And since then, this process has been continuing on and on. And this is something very unique to the Quran because you'll not find any other book being committed to memory in such a large number and then being transmitted. And the written recitation was actually which followed the oral recitation. So whatever you were speaking or whatever you were reciting was put to the pen and the paper or and various instruments of those times, and it always needed the testification or the testimony of a hafiz to say that whatever has been written is correctly written. So you see, it was basically a novel way of transmitting something, the Quran, I would say, which was, of course, not very novel in the culture in which the Quran originated. You would be knowing that the Arabs basically they were people in whom orality was a very very common thing. So they would have these genealogies learned by heart. Abu Bakr
Yeah.
himself, anhu, was a genealogist who had all these genealogies in his head, and they used to rely on this
Yeah.
memory, on this prodigious memory. So this is
Absolutely.
how the Quran was
Even
preserved.
even some people today, like I was listening to Professor Keith Small, who's also somebody very involved in Quran kind of manuscripts, and he was saying as well that it's very clear from how the early manuscripts are that it's very clear and evident, self-evident, that there was a very strong oral tradition, and this was simply like a kind of code to help people, to nudge them along. It
Hmm.
wasn't actually something like people trying to. I mean, I just thought that's a very. It just goes in with what you're saying. So, okay, so the oral tradition was there. This part, okay, I think very few people would doubt that. The Prophet ﷺ, in his lifetime the Quran is complete and it's being taught to the companions. He passes away, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What, in your belief, happens then? In as part of this paragraph, before we expand on the some of the maybe the difficult objections or problems.
So you see, a very unique method was adopted in the transmission of the Quran. So if you ask me what happened at the death of the Prophet, or what was the status of the Quran at the death of the Prophet, I would say that it was with the living tradition of the Muslims. It was being written, it was being taught, it was being read, it was being memorized, it was being done like a comparative text as well. So all kinds of things which are which living tradition of any religious community would have was possessed by the Quran. So at the time of the Prophet's death, there were students of the Prophet who had written it down, but the Prophet never left an officially compiled written Quran. That he never did.
Yeah.
And I think that was a very wise thing as well, because protecting something written is not easy. All things can creep in a society where we have so many things, and the custody of that Musaf would have been very difficult, and over a period of time it could have just rotten away. So this was just partly adopted.
Yeah.
That written culture was there, but it was never relied upon, and the Prophet never gave a written sort of a Quran to his companions. The companions themselves wrote it down for themselves. So it was basically like students taking notes, and then all of them comparing those notes to each other and coming up with the same result. And the way the Prophet himself received the Quran was oral. He never wrote it down for himself. We know that he was not conversant with reading and writing. So, I mean, not writing, he could understand. So he just got it from Gabriel. And the way he got it from Gabriel was that oral tradition. And he transferred it exactly in the manner that he received it from Gabriel. And this is how the Quran was transferred. So the stories that what the caliphs did after the Prophet's demise, like for example, did Abu Bakr write a Musaf or did Usman made copies, I think they are grossly inflated and misrepresented and misinterpreted. All that they did was they just spread the Quran, which was already there, being responsible caliphs of their kingdom. They wanted it to expand and for new Muslim converts, and there were wars going on. There were people coming into the folds of Islam, and they wanted more copies of the Quran. So what they did was they spread far and wide these copies of the Quran. But the stories which are mentioned in Bukhari and in some of the other hadith books regarding how the Quran came to be compiled, I've shown in my research that they lack not only in their isnad a lot of problems, but in the content as well.
Yeah, there's a
So,
lot of conflicting
right.
narrations as well, and you show that so well in the book.